11 men entered the Ituri forest in the autumn of 1923. By the 7th morning, 3 of them were gone, and the remaining 8 had abandoned every piece of equipment, every collected specimen, every record of the survey, and fled through the jungle in darkness toward the nearest navigable river. I am the last of those 8 men still living, and I have not spoken of what happened in that forest for more than 40 years. I had made 3 previous journeys into the Congo basin before that survey, each of them routine, each of them professionally productive, and none of them remotely like what happened in October of that year. I had worked in the Kasai region in 1916, in the Lomami forest in 1919, and along the upper Aruwimi in 1921. I had encountered difficult terrain, difficult weather, and on one occasion, a very large and irritable forest elephant that had required us to abandon a field position and move camp quickly. I had never encountered anything that caused me to doubt my understanding of the natural world in any fundamental way. I was a rational man trained in the empirical tradition, and the empirical tradition had served me adequately in every environment I had previously worked in. The 1923 expedition was organized at the request of the Royal Belgian Botanical Society, which had received reports from a colonial administrator named De Vries about an unmapped stretch of the Ituri forest between the Epulu and Ituri rivers. De Vries had traveled to the edge of this region during a routine inspection journey in 1921 and had noted in his report that the vegetation density and canopy characteristics suggested an area of unusual botanical interest. He described canopy heights he estimated at 40 meters or more, with a density and diversity of epiphytic growth that he said exceeded anything he had seen in the surrounding forest. He was not a botanist, and his observations were lay observations, but they were detailed enough to attract the Society's attention and to justify commissioning a formal survey. De Vries had not penetrated far into the region he was describing. When I later read his notes carefully, I noticed that he had also written, somewhat obliquely, and that the local Mambuti people he had encountered at the forest edge had expressed what he described as unusual reluctance to accompany him further. At the time I read this, I attributed it to the standard difficulties of engaging local guides in remote areas. I had encountered such reluctance before in other parts of the Congo. It had never meant anything significant. I noted it as a logistical consideration and moved on to the botanical content of De Vries's report. I assembled the survey team in Stanleyville in early September of 1923. There were 11 of us in total. Myself as lead botanist, a junior botanist named Henri Girard, 27 years old and newly qualified, who had been recommended to me by the Society and who had never been to the Congo before. Henri was an enthusiastic and technically competent man whose primary professional interest was arachnology rather than botany, which was a somewhat unusual background for a botanical survey, but which the Society had considered an asset given that the survey area might yield significant invertebrate findings alongside the plant material. A Belgian colonial survey officer named Lieutenant Renard, 34 years old, who had been assigned to the expedition by the administration to handle logistics and coordinate with local contacts. 3 porters from Stanleyville, experienced men I had worked with on earlier surveys, whose names were Joseph, Thomas, and Felix. And 5 Mbuti guides and carriers arranged through a contact in the village of Mambasa at men who knew the Ituri intimately and whose knowledge of the forest interior was essential to any expedition of this kind. The journey from Stanleyville to the edge of our target survey area took 8 days, partly by river steamer and partly on foot along existing colonial tracks through secondary forest. We made good time and encountered no difficulties of any consequence during the approach. The forest in that part of the Congo is never easy terrain, but experienced men move through it at a reasonable pace when conditions are dry, and October in the Ituri is generally dry. The Mbuti guides set a confident pace, and the porters were accustomed to the conditions, and the overall mood of the expedition during the approach was professional and reasonably optimistic. By the 17th of September, we had reached the furthest point covered by De Vries in his 1921 journey. It was marked in his notes by a large strangler fig at the edge of a section of particularly dense forest, and we found the fig without difficulty. It was an impressive specimen, easily 30 meters tall, its aerial roots having long since overwhelmed the host tree and become the primary structure, with a canopy that spread perhaps 25 meters in diameter and a root mass at the base that resembled a bundle of enormous gray cables laid against the earth. Beyond it, the canopy thickened noticeably and the undergrowth became denser. It looked exactly as De Vries had described it, and exactly as I had hoped it would look. It was here that I had the first conversation with the Mbuti guides that I would later think about with great frequency. The 5 guides had been cooperative and professional throughout the journey from Mombasa. They were skilled, knowledgeable men, and their understanding of the forest was not merely navigational, but encyclopedic. They knew which plants were useful for medicine and which were poisonous. They knew the territories of forest elephants by subtle signs invisible to me. They knew the behavioral patterns of a dozen species of antelope by the quality of their tracks, and their reading of the forest environment was a form of literacy I had always found impressive. But when we reached the fig tree and I informed them through our interpreter that we would be entering the denser forest the following morning, the reaction was different from anything I'd encountered in previous expeditions. The oldest guide, a man whose name in translation means something close to grandfather of the river, did not simply express reluctance. He expressed something I can only describe as structured refusal. He spoke at length to the interpreter, and the interpreter conveyed the substance of what he said with a careful precision that suggested he was trying to get it right. The oldest guide explained that the section of forest ahead had a name in the Mbuti language that translated roughly as the forest where the builders live. He said the builders were not animals in the way Europeans understood animals. He said they had been in this forest longer than the Mbuti people had been in the forest, and the Mbuti had been in the forest since the world was made. And he said the builders worked only in darkness and worked upward. He said their constructions had no opening and no door. I listened to all of this, and I thanked him for the information, and I told him through the interpreter that we would be entering the forest the following morning and that I expected his assistance as agreed. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression that I could not read clearly. Then he nodded and said nothing further. I recorded his warning in my field notebook that evening and noted it as local folklore connected to unusual web-building insects, possibly a species of colonial spider unknown to European science and of potential significant interest. This seemed to me at the time to be the rational interpretation. Henri, when I shared the guide's description with him, Kais became almost immediately excited about the possibility of a large and previously undescribed social spider species constructing coordinated structures in the forest canopy. We discussed it for some time that evening as a scientific possibility, and I recorded his thoughts alongside the guide's warning. The scientific framing of the observation felt appropriate. It still feels appropriate to me, even now, in the sense that what we encountered was certainly a biological organism of some kind. It does not, however, feel sufficient. We entered the denser forest on the morning of the 18th of September. The change in environment was immediately apparent. The canopy here was higher and considerably denser than in the surrounding forest, perhaps 35 to 40 meters above us, being with the crown layer so continuous that the light reaching the forest floor was reduced to a dim greenish half-light even at midday. The undergrowth was correspondingly thinner than in more open forest, which made movement somewhat easier, but the overall effect was of a vast enclosed space, like moving through the interior of a cathedral whose ceiling you could not quite see and whose walls were composed of tree trunks rising without branches for 20 meters before spreading into the canopy above. Sound behaved differently here. Our footsteps and the movement of our equipment seemed muffled and close, while the sounds of the forest itself seemed distant and above us rather than surrounding us as they normally would. The air was noticeably cooler and considerably more humid, and it carried a faint smell I did not immediately identify. Something faintly organic and faintly metallic, like damp earth mixed with something I could not name. I noted it in my field book and moved on. Henri was cataloguing epiphytes on the lower trunks of the trees we passed, and had already identified what he believed was an undescribed species of bromeliad within the first kilometer. The scientific work was engaging and immediately rewarding, and the strangeness of the environment was more exciting than unsettling at that stage. We established our base camp approximately 3 kilometers into the forest, selecting a natural clearing formed by the fall of 2 large trees some years earlier. The clearing was roughly 20 meters across and gave us a patch of open sky above, which was both practically useful for drying specimens and psychologically welcome after the enclosed feeling of the forest interior. The fallen logs themselves were already hosting a remarkable community of organisms, bracket fungi in multiple species, numerous mosses, several orchids, and what Henri identified as a possible new genus of small insectivorous plant growing in the decomposing wood at the log's center. We were in the right place. The botanical promise of the location was evident within minutes of arriving. The 3 porters established the tents and equipment while Lieutenant Renard and I walked the perimeter of the clearing to assess the site. Renard was a practical and experienced colonial officer who had worked in the Congo for 6 years and whose approach to his work was methodical and unsentimental. So he approved of the clearing, noted the sight lines to the main path, and confirmed that the water source I had identified on De Vries's sketch map was accessible approximately 300 meters to the east. Then he lit a cigarette and stood at the edge of the clearing looking into the forest in a way that I found myself watching. I asked him what he was looking at. He said he was not looking at anything specific. He said the forest felt different here from forest he had been in before. I asked him in what way. He said he could not specify it precisely, but that it felt as though the forest were listening. I told him that was an unusual observation for a man of his professional temperament. He agreed that it was and said nothing further about it. The first 2 days of survey work were highly productive. And Henri and I made 2 collection excursions each day, ranging up to 2 kilometers from base camp in different directions, and the botanical findings more than justified everything De Vries had suggested. The plant density in this section of the Ituri was genuinely unusual, and within the first 2 days I'd collected specimens of at least 4 species I could not immediately identify from my reference materials, which was extraordinary. The species diversity was higher than anything I had recorded in comparable Congo survey areas, and the physical scale of many specimens was notable, with certain fern species reaching heights I had not previously encountered. The epiphytic communities on the upper canopy trees, when we could observe them through Henri's telescope, appeared to include orchid species far beyond the range I would have expected at this latitude. The Mbuti guides performed their work efficiently and without complaint, though I noticed that they consistently positioned themselves toward the interior of the camp rather than the perimeter, and that they rarely moved into the forest alone even for short distances. I attributed this to standard caution. The Ituri at this depth was genuine wilderness, and caution was entirely sensible. I did not note it as significant at the time. On the evening of the second day, one of the Mbuti carriers, a younger man named Amadi, came to me and said something through the interpreter that I wrote down verbatim in my notebook. He said that something was measuring the camp. He said it had been measuring the camp since we arrived. I asked him what he meant, and he looked at the tree line for a moment before answering. He said that it walked the boundary. He said it did not come inside. He said, "Not yet." I asked him what was walking the boundary, and he said a word in his own language that the interpreter declined to translate directly, saying only that it meant something that makes enclosures. I thanked Amadi and wrote the exchange in my notebook and returned to my specimen work. I did not sleep particularly well that night. The forest was noisier at night than during the day, which is entirely normal in tropical environments. But there was a particular quality to the sounds that I noticed and could not quite categorize. The usual chorus of insects and frogs was present, but beneath it there was an intermittent sound at the edge of audibility. A low, dry, irregular sound that was not quite clicking and not quite scraping and not quite like anything I'd heard in the forest before. It moved. It would be at one point of the compass and then at another, and the movement was slow and deliberate, describing a rough circuit of the clearing over the course of perhaps 30 minutes before completing and beginning again. I listened to it for approximately an hour before I fell asleep and told myself it was some large insect species I had not previously encountered. On the morning of the third day, I found the first silk strand. It was stretched between two ironwood trees at the northern edge of the clearing, approximately 8 meters above the ground. I noticed it because the morning light came from a low angle that lit the strand from the side, and making it visible against the dark canopy background as a line of pale light, like a wire strung between the trees. I called Henri over to examine it with me, and we spent some time measuring and documenting it carefully. I estimated its diameter at between 8 and 10 millimeters, thicker than a standard pencil. The strand ran approximately 15 meters between the two trees and was taut and perfectly horizontal, with no sag at the center despite the span. The anchor points at each end were not single attachment spots, but dense pads of the same material, flattened against the bark and spreading perhaps 20 centimeters in diameter, almost like the base of a button securing a thread to cloth. The material itself was a warm white color, slightly translucent where the light caught it at an angle. And we had not seen this strand the previous evening. This meant it had been placed during the night in complete darkness at a height of 8 meters, with a span of 15 meters and an anchor geometry that was symmetrical to within what appeared to be a very small margin of error. Henri was enthusiastic. He believed we had found evidence of a colonial spider species of extraordinary size and of immediately significant scientific importance. He began constructing theoretical frameworks about the silk properties based on its visible diameter and the tension characteristics observable in the strand. I was more cautious, and the reason for my caution was the geometry. The strand was perfectly horizontal. The anchor pads at each end were symmetrical in size and placement. The span was precise. But this was not the irregular, opportunistic construction of any web-building spider I had ever studied. The web-building behavior I knew was adaptive, responsive to the immediate environment, taking advantage of available attachment points in whatever configuration they presented. This had a planned quality. The attachment points had been selected and prepared. The strand had been placed at a specific height for what appeared to be a specific purpose. I collected a sample of the silk and noted the location and measurements in my survey records. I did not consider moving the camp at that stage. In retrospect, this was the moment I should have made a different decision. On the morning of the fourth day, we found a second strand, this one lower, approximately 4 meters above the ground on the western side of the clearing. And it was thicker than the first, perhaps 12 millimeters in diameter, and it ran between two large emergent roots, rather than tree trunks, anchored in the same pad configuration as the first strand. And on the south side of the clearing, at approximately the same height as the second strand, there was a third strand running at a slight angle between two trees that flanked the main entrance path. Lieutenant Renard, who had been following the discovery of each strand, with a growing attentiveness that I recognized as professional concern rather than scientific interest, spent some time that morning measuring the positions and heights of all 3 strands relative to the camp. When he had finished, he showed me the sketch he had made. The 3 strands were positioned at roughly equal intervals around the clearing, and each one oriented roughly parallel to the edge of the camp. The spacing was not geometrically perfect, but the intention was unmistakable. They described a perimeter. They were not random placements. Renard said it quietly and without emphasis, as if stating an administrative fact. They describe a rough perimeter. They are not random placements. I looked at his sketch and I looked at the map and I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said that I thought we should speak again with Grandfather of the River, and that I thought we should do so at length. That evening I sat with the oldest Mbuti guide and the interpreter, and we talked for perhaps an hour. I asked him everything I could think to ask about what he had told me at the fig tree and about what Amadi had said to me on the second evening. He was willing to speak at length. He told me that his grandfather had spoken of the builders, and that his grandfather's account had been passed down carefully because it contained a warning his people did not want to lose. He said that the builders first placed boundary strands around a territory they intended to enclose. He said these boundary strands were the measurement stage, and that once the measurement was complete, the enclosing would begin. He said the enclosing happened quickly, in a single night, and that it was thorough. He said that anything inside the enclosure, when it was completed, would not be able to leave, not because it would be immediately harmed, but because the structure, once complete, was entirely without opening. He said his grandfather's account described a hunting camp that his people had established in this part of the forest many generations ago, near before the Mbuti had learned to recognize the warning signs. He said the men in that camp had been in the enclosure when it was finished and had not come out. He said his people had gone away from that part of the Ituri and had not returned until very recently, and that the encounter I was describing matched exactly what his grandfather's account had warned of. I spent a long time writing in my notebook that night. I wrote down everything the guide had said, and I wrote down what Renard had observed about the perimeter strands, and I wrote down a long series of rational frameworks I was still trying to maintain around all of it. But I also wrote, at the bottom of the page, a note that I kept from that night forward. Consider moving camp at first light if no satisfactory resolution emerges. I did not move the camp at first light because Henri woke me before dawn with a voice I had not heard from him before, controlled but tight with something that was not quite excitement and not quite fear. He had risen before dawn and gone to the northern edge of the clearing where the first strand was. What he found there was that the single strand had been joined by additional strands, now numbering 12 by his count, running between the same two ironwood trees and extending along the tree line in both directions. The individual strands were spaced approximately 40 centimeters apart vertically, creating a ladder-like series of parallel horizontal lines against the dark of the forest behind them. And from the uppermost strand, a series of secondary strands ran upward into the canopy itself, disappearing into the foliage 15 or more meters above, connecting the lower structure to something in the upper canopy that was not visible from the ground. Henri described the structure with the precision of a trained scientist who had spent a sleepless night cataloging it, and what came through underneath the precision was a quality of controlled alarm that I had not seen in him before. He said the construction was not what a spider of even extraordinary individual size could achieve alone. He said the geometry of the placement suggested coordinated construction, multiple working points proceeding simultaneously toward a shared design. He said he thought there might be more than one organism involved. And I told Henri that we would document the structure, and then we would break camp and move at least 2 kilometers to the south to establish a new observation position from a greater distance. Henri argued with me. He believed we were on the verge of a major zoological finding and that moving away from the site was scientifically unjustifiable. I told him I was not moving away from the site for scientific reasons, and that my authority as expedition lead was final on matters of team safety. We were still in the middle of this exchange when one of the porters came quickly across the clearing toward us. Joseph had gone at first light to collect water from the small stream 300 meters to the east. He had taken the water containers and had walked the path we had been using twice daily since our arrival. And he had been gone for 45 minutes, which was considerably longer than the task required. The porter who came to find us, Thomas, said that one of the Mbuti carriers had noticed the time and pointed it out, and that no one could see Joseph on the path or hear him when they called. We searched for him for the remainder of that morning with the full party, all 11 of us moving in coordinated pairs through the forest in an expanding pattern from the point where the path to the stream left the clearing. We found his water containers on the path approximately 200 meters from camp. They had been set down carefully on a raised route, not dropped or knocked over, but placed there with deliberation. The container lids were still on. First, there was no disturbance of the path surface around the containers and no marks in the surrounding undergrowth that I could identify as human movement leaving the path. The air in the immediate area had a quality I recognized. The faint, metallic organic smell from our first morning in the forest was present, but stronger and with an additional sweetness to it that I found heavily unpleasant. Henry crouched and sniffed carefully and said it was a chemical compound consistent with certain insect-derived compounds used for paralysis or sedation. He said it quietly, without looking at me. We did not find Joseph. Lieutenant Renard wanted to send a runner back to Mombasa immediately to report a missing person and request assistance. I agreed. Felix, one of the Stanleyville porters and the fastest walker among us, was given written instructions and dispatched south along the path shortly after midday. I watched him move quickly into the forest until the trees closed behind him. I did not know at the time that I would not see Felix again. Whether he made it out of the forest or not, I am still unable to say with certainty. The channels of communication I'd expected to find operational when we ourselves emerged from the forest were not functioning as anticipated, and the matter was never fully clarified. That afternoon, I held a full meeting of the remaining 10 members of the expedition, and I told them clearly what I understood the situation to be. I told them that we had lost one man under unexplained circumstances, that we were observing biological activity of an unprecedented nature, and that I was reassessing whether to remain at the current camp. I did not tell them everything that Grandfather of the River had told me. I'm not certain that decision was correct, but at the time I judged that the full weight of that account would have caused a panic that would have been dangerous in its own right. I told them instead that we would remain one more night, that we would maintain a full watch rotation throughout the night, and that if the morning did not provide some clearer understanding of our situation, we would begin moving south. The night of the 4th day was the worst night I have ever spent in any location in my life, and I have spent nights in the Congo during the influenza years, nights on the Lomami in conditions of genuine physical hardship. My nights in circumstances I would previously have described as genuinely difficult. None of them were this. The forest around the camp became completely silent approximately 2 hours after sunset. Not the intermittent quiet of a forest at rest, but an absolute silence, as sudden and complete as if someone had closed a door. The frogs stopped. The insects stopped. The night birds that had been calling from somewhere in the mid-canopy fell mute. There was no wind. The silence was so total that I became aware of the sounds my own body was making, my heartbeat, my breathing, the small shifting noises of my clothing when I moved. The men in the camp became very still in the way that people become still when they understand instinctively that stillness is the appropriate response to a situation they do not understand. After perhaps 10 minutes of this silence, the sound began. It was coming from the canopy above and around the clearing, not from one point, but from multiple points simultaneously. The character of the sound was hard to describe precisely. It was dry and rhythmic, with a clicking quality, but not a simple clicking. There were layers to it, some elements at a higher frequency and some at a lower frequency, and together they produced a sound that had a texture, a pattern that repeated every few seconds with small variations, and beneath the clicking there was something else, a vibration, more felt than heard, a trembling in the air itself, as if the atmosphere were being displaced by something very large, moving at a moderate speed through the space above us. The sound moved around the perimeter of the clearing in a slow circuit, and it would grow slightly louder at one point, and then diminish as it moved to another, describing a rough orbit of the camp that took approximately 15 minutes to complete, after which it would start again. The orbit tightened slightly over the first few hours of the night, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The circuit that began at what I estimated was 20 meters from the clearing edge had narrowed to perhaps 15 meters by midnight. I could not see anything in the canopy. The moon was up, but the canopy here was too dense to allow meaningful light into the clearing, and my lantern illuminated only the immediate area around me. Whatever was moving above us was moving in complete darkness and was not caught by any light I was able to direct upward. I tried. At one point, I climbed onto the smaller of the two fallen logs at the edge of the clearing and held my lantern as high above my head as I could reach and aimed it at the canopy and saw nothing but leaves. We sat through the night in a group near the center of the clearing, 10 men now, and none of us slept. Renard sat with his service pistol in his hand, though I did not think it would be of use, and I believe he knew this. The Mbuti guides sat together slightly apart from the rest of us and were very still. Grandfather of the river sat with his eyes closed for much of the night, and his lips were moving very slightly. I did not ask what he was saying. Toward midnight, I heard something I have spent the rest of my life trying to describe adequately. It came from above the northern edge of the clearing, close above the ironwood trees. A long, slow, deliberate sound of something being drawn very tight. Not a single pull, but a series of measured tensions, each one sustained for several seconds, like a rigger setting the tension on a line in stages. The sound of the material under tension was characteristic, a high, sustained note slightly different in quality from any rope or cable I'd previously heard under load. It went on for perhaps 30 seconds and then stopped. There was silence for a full minute. Then the clicking and vibration resumed from a different point of the compass and continued for another hour before returning to the north. Henri sat beside me, and after a while he said very quietly that it was constructing. He said he thought it was placing new structural elements around the clearing. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. When the light of the 5th morning came and was sufficient to see by, we understood what had happened during the night. The structure had expanded far beyond what the individual strands on the previous morning had suggested. The north and east sides of the clearing were enclosed behind a continuous curtain of dense silk extending from the ground to the canopy in a single unbroken sheet. The individual strands that had been visible before were gone as identifiable elements, subsumed into the unified structure. The material was dense and compressed, not a mesh in the way a web is a mesh, but something closer to woven fabric, a surface rather than a screen. It blocked light. Where the morning sun was coming through the clearing from the south, the shadow of the silk wall was sharp and definite on the ground. When I walked to it and pressed my hand against it, it did not give. The texture against my palm was dry and faintly warm, and under my fingers I could feel a microscopic regularity, a weave, as if each element of the surface had been placed with consistent tension and spacing. I pressed harder, and the surface did not move. I took my machete from my belt and struck it with a full swing, and the machete glanced off without cutting. The material gave perhaps half a centimeter under the impact, and then returned to its original position. The western side of the clearing was partially enclosed, with strands crossing at several heights, but not yet forming a complete barrier. The southern side was still open, but with 2 new anchor strands visible at the entrance to the main path, one at either side at about shoulder height, not spanning the path, but positioned like posts at the edge of a gate that was not yet built. I told everyone in the group that we were leaving immediately. I said it once, and there was no debate. We took what we could carry quickly, and we left. I took my field notebooks, my specimen cases, my compass, and my personal pack. I left the tents, the specimen drying equipment, most of the food stores, and Henri's collection cases, which he was distressed about, but which I was not going to allow to delay us. We moved out of the clearing through the southern opening in the silk barrier at approximately 6 in the morning. As I passed through the southern gap and moved on to the path, I turned and looked back at the clearing. From outside the enclosure, the scale of the construction was entirely different from how it had appeared from the inside. and the silk wall on the north and east sides was only part of a larger structure. From outside I could see that the construction extended upward above the canopy, perhaps 15 to 20 meters above the top of the surrounding trees, in a rising form that suggested the wall was not a wall but the side of an enclosing structure, a dome or an ovoid, with the visible curtain being only its lower section. In the morning light, the upper portion of the structure was visible above the canopy as a pale mass, slightly translucent against the sky, large enough to be seen clearly from a distance of 50 meters and probably visible from much further. The scale of what had been built in a single night was not something I was able to immediately incorporate into any rational framework. As we moved south at the best pace the terrain and the condition of our party allowed, approximately 1 kilometer from the camp, we stopped at a small stream to refill our water containers and allow the older members of the party a brief rest. I counted the group. 9 of us now: Henri, Renard, 2 porters, and 5 Mbuti guides. We had been 10 when we left the clearing, and I counted again to be certain. We were 9. The third Stanleyville porter, Thomas, had been with us when we departed the clearing. I had seen him walking on the path behind the Mbuti guides, carrying his own pack. Somewhere in the kilometer between the clearing and the stream, without sound, without any disturbance that any of the 9 remaining people had noticed, Thomas had ceased to be on the path. I did not investigate. I made the decision not to, and it is a decision I have thought about many times since without arriving at a different conclusion. I called out twice. There was no response. The forest around the stream was silent in the same evacuated way the forest near the camp had been silent. I told the remaining group that we were continuing south immediately, and we moved. We walked through the rest of the 5th day without stopping except for water. The forest was profoundly silent. No birds, no small animal sounds, no movement in the undergrowth. The Mbuti guide set the route and maintained a pace that was at the edge of what I could sustain over an extended period, and I did not ask them to slow down. Twice on the path I saw single silk strands crossing above us at height, too thin and too isolated to be part of a structure and possibly the work of ordinary spiders. But I routed us beneath them carefully and told myself I was being rational. We made camp for the 5th night in a location with no natural clearing, only a section of forest where the trees were somewhat more widely spaced and where the undergrowth was thin enough to allow us to sit and arrange ourselves without being crowded. There was no silk visible anywhere from our position. The men were exhausted and frightened and largely silent, and the shared experience of the previous night and the previous days had created among us a kind of coherence that did not require speech. That night the sound returned, but from the north, from the direction of the original camp, at a distance I estimated at several hundred meters, possibly a kilometer or more. The forest was so silent that even a sound at that distance carried clearly. And what I heard for approximately 3 hours was the sound of construction continuing. The same clicking and vibration I recognized, now proceeding at what seemed like a faster rate than during the night in the clearing. The pace of it was relentless and methodical, and it continued without significant pause for those 3 hours, and then stopped suddenly at what I estimated was 3 o'clock in the morning. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat through the remaining hours until dawn with my field notebook on my knees and wrote nothing, because there was nothing I wanted to write down. On the morning of the 6th day, I told the group that we were going to move continuously until we reached the forest margin, stopping only for water. We had perhaps 14 kilometers remaining, as the Mbuti guide said that they knew a route that was direct and that they could hold the pace. Grandfather of the river, when this plan was conveyed to him, said one thing that I recorded. "It will let some of you leave. It does not need all of you." I asked him what he meant. He said that the camp was built now. He said that what was in it when it was finished was inside. He said that what had already been taken was taken and that the rest of us were free to go. He said it with a certainty that was not reassuring. We moved through the 6th day at a hard, continuous pace. The forest began to change as we went south. The canopy dropped gradually. The undergrowth thickened as the light increased. Bird sounds began to return, distant at first, and then closer. Normal forest sounds reasserted themselves incrementally over the course of the day. And there was something almost painful about the relief of hearing ordinary forest birds calling from the canopy above us. Late in the afternoon, with perhaps 4 kilometers still remaining, Amadi, the young Mbuti carrier who had told me on the second night that something was measuring the camp, was walking directly behind me on the path. I heard him say something quietly to the man behind him. I turned approximately 10 seconds later, and he was not there. The man behind him said that he had been there a moment before and had stopped, not stumbled, not made a sound, not stepped off the path. Stopped and was gone. Grandfather of the river, when he was told, said something in his own language, and the other Mbuti guides made a sound of acknowledgement. I did not ask for a translation. We did not stop. We moved faster. Now the light began to fail at approximately 5:30, and we entered the secondary growth zone at the forest margin when it was already nearly dark. The change was immediate and unmistakable. The canopy dropped and thinned. The sky was visible above us in a deepening gray blue. The undergrowth thickened and grabbed at our legs, and the sound returned to the world completely. Insects calling in number. Frogs in the water at the forest margin. Night birds in the lower canopy. All of it present and ordinary and entirely welcome. I have never in my life felt such a specific and physical sense of relief at the sound of a frog. We reached the nearest village at approximately 10 o'clock that night. 7 of us. Myself, Henri Girard, Lieutenant Renard, 1 Stanleyville porter, and 3 of the original 5 Mbuti guides. And the colonial administration sent an investigation party to the location of our camp 3 weeks later. The report they produced was brief and was not widely distributed. A copy was shared with me by a contact at the administration the following year, and I've kept it since. The investigation party reported that they had located the campsite and had observed it from a distance. They reported that the camp was entirely enclosed in a dense white structure of unknown origin that rose approximately 20 meters above the surrounding canopy. They reported that the structure appeared intact and showed no visible deterioration. They reported that they had not approached closely. They did not attempt to enter it or to recover any materials. They reported that during their observation period, the structure had vibrated on 3 occasions in a localized manner, suggesting activity within the interior. They had no explanation for this observation. They recommended that the area be designated a restricted zone and that no further expeditions be sent. Joseph and Thomas and Amadi were recorded in the administration's files as missing in the field, cause unknown. I have spent many years, since October of 1923, thinking about the Ituri and about what we encountered there and about what it tells us, if it tells us anything coherent about what lives in the deep forest and about the nature of territory and the nature of precedence. I was trained to observe and classify and understand the natural world, and I still believe that what was in that forest was a natural organism of some kind, something biological, something that had evolved over time to perform the tasks we witnessed it performing. But the categories we used to describe the natural world were built for things we have previously encountered, and this was not something any of the categories were built for. The Mbuti had categories for it. Their categories were not scientific categories. They were categories built from direct experience over many generations, from the experience of people who had lived alongside this thing for as long as it had existed in the Ituri and who had learned at significant cost what it did and what it meant when it began doing it. Grandfather of the river did not tell us that the builders were supernatural. He told us they were old and territorial and precise and that they built enclosures with no door. All of those things were accurate. All of those things were things I could confirm from direct observation. The Mbuti knowledge was better knowledge than mine, and it was better knowledge precisely because it was built from the kind of sustained long-term encounter with the actual thing that scientific expeditions of a few weeks' duration cannot produce. The forest is very old. The things that live in the deep forest in places like the Ituri Basin are old in a way that is difficult to hold in the mind. Our expeditions, our surveys, our classifications and collection efforts, and the scientific frameworks we bring to bear on the natural world are recent and peripheral and presumptuous in ways we do not usually acknowledge. We went into a territory that was occupied. We set up a camp inside something's hunting ground, and we were studied, measured, as impartially taken in the same methodical way that I myself study and measure and take specimens from the environments I work in. The only significant difference between what happened to Joseph and Thomas and Amadi and what I do professionally to specimens of botanical interest is that the thing doing the taking in the Ituri was considerably better at its work than I am at mine. I have not returned to the Congo since 1923. I finished my professional career in a botanical laboratory in Ghent, and I raised a family, and I lived what by ordinary measures was a full and useful life. But I have thought about the Ituri almost every day since that October, and I have never been able to stop thinking about the men we left behind in it, and I have never been able to stop thinking about the sound I heard from inside that clearing. Boom, the sound of the silk being drawn tight in stages, measuring the tension, working through the night with a patience and a precision and a complete indifference to our presence that I found then, and find now, to be the most quietly terrible thing I have ever witnessed. We were not in danger in the way that we typically understand danger. We were not being hunted in the way that prey is hunted. We were in someone's working territory, and 3 of us were incorporated into its work in the way that a botanist incorporates specimens into a collection. The remaining 7 of us were allowed to leave because, as grandfather of the river said, we were not needed. The camp was sufficient. What was in the camp when the enclosure was completed was sufficient. I think about what sufficient means in that context sometimes, and then I stop thinking about it. The builders are still there. Whatever investigation the colonial administration conducted, whatever restricted zone was designated, none of it constitutes the kind of removal or disruption that would change the fundamental situation. The Ituri forest is larger than Belgium and older than recorded history, and the builders have been in it longer than the Mbuti, and the Mbuti have been there since the world was made. A Belgian survey team and a subsequent 3-week investigation are not events of significance in a timeline like that. I am 80 years old, and I do not have many years left, and I have finally decided to speak about this because I believe the account should exist somewhere outside my own memory. And I believe that anyone who reads this and who works in the Ituri or in the deep Congo forest should know that the Mbuti warning about the forest where the builders live is not folklore. It is taxonomy. It is a precise description of a real organism with a real and consistent behavioral pattern, one that the Mbuti have been accurately describing for many generations. The boundary strands are the first sign. When you find the boundary strands, leave immediately. Do not document them. Do not study them. Leave immediately and do not return. I wish someone had told me that before I entered the forest in 1923.